You're watching ITG Clips.
As the modern game especially is about moving your chess pieces around the board to create the individual matchups you find most appealing against the weak spots of a defense. If your stud receiver, for example, is out wide, but you're facing a secondary with a liability inside at nickelback, why not be versatile enough from a personnel standpoint to move your guys around to produce the matchup needed to exploit that defensive limitation to the fullest? But back in years past, the roles played by each receiver spot in this system were more narrowly tailored. The X and Z occupied the perimeter while the H and Y were the slots. That still holds true, but the scouting report on each back then was probably a little tighter than it is today. To briefly describe each position, let's start out of a basic RIP formation, the first thing installed by any run and shoot coach. It's a balanced formation with two receivers left and two receivers to the right. How central was this to the original offense? Run and shoot godfather Mouse Davis used to tell his offense that if he didn't bother to call a formation, then just automatically line up and rip. That's how much it was used. Let's start out wide with the X. Both the X and the Z were more in keeping with what you'd expect from the prototypical wideouts in a traditional offense. The X was a backside player, so by virtue of formations being called away from him, he was often going to be left singled up in coverage to the boundary. When the offense lined up in trips open, which was frequent in the run and shoot, the X was left alone, and if the defense didn't cheat a will linebacker out to help or park a safety over to that side, the corner was often isolated to try and cover him with no help. The best way to consistently punish a defense when they offered up single coverage to this side was to deploy a large-framed player blessed with a technique to shed press coverage, the speed to climb the ladder quickly, and the size and strength to outmuscle an isolated corner. It also called for a route runner disciplined enough to get in and out of his cuts quickly enough to fully take advantage of the short option routes he would be running to the backside of the play. In other words, the X was typically your most complete perimeter player. At Glenville, we found the ideal X in 6'3", 230-pound Walt Wilbon. That's a name, by the way, that you'll hear again in a future episode. When Rich was the offensive coordinator at Clemson in 1999, former high school quarterback Rod Gardner was the ideal X in his system at 6'4", 215 pounds. Blessed with playmaking ability, strength, and a knack for beating single coverage, Gardner, a future first-round pick, flourished in Coach Rod's offense as the first 1,000-yard receiver in Clemson history.
They need the first down first. Third down and 12. Chancellor going for a bunch for Gardner. Lots of pushing. He has it! At the 8-yard line, Rod Gardner.
But when you're thinking of the perfect player created in a lab to play the X spot, think of the late, great Chris Henry.
Well, that's taking advantage of a tall receiver. Henry's 6'4.5", maybe close to 6'5".
At 6'4", 200 pounds with leaping ability, sticky hands, and off-the-charts hand-eye coordination, Slim was nearly uncoverable. There were 41 players in the 2003 college football season who eclipsed 1,000 yards receiving, but none of them did so on fewer catches than the 41 by Chris Henry. His 24.5 yards per grab led the nation, and in just 23 games as a Mountaineer, he hauled in 22 touchdown receptions. Henry was a matchup nightmare on the perimeter. Leaving him in single coverage on the backside was defensive suicide, but oftentimes even safety help didn't matter. Watch him snatch this go ball away from two Miami defenders, including a cover two safety playing over the top for a big pickup. This is exactly the way an X receiver was meant to punish the backside of a defense within the design of this offense. Slide inside to the H receiver position, occupying that backside slot. In the classic run and shoot, the H was at times isolated as a favorable matchup in the pass game against linebackers, but was also often involved in elements of the run game out of the slot that were intended to stress the defense horizontally, jet sweeps and the like. Since the H position was involved in both running routes and carrying the football, a skill set that tended to translate well was that of a shifty running back. This skill set also meant the H could provide depth at the running back spot, stepping in on occasion to spell your feature back. In the early years at Glenville, our H spot was Kevin Blanding, a former junior college running back standout who was dangerous in space but also possessed great ball skills, a perfect fit for what we were doing with the position at the time. Back then, the H was also heavily involved in motion as the primary runner when we changed formations. Motion was a big part of the classic run and shoot, but as Rich focused through the years even more on the speed of attacking with no huddle, he began to phase out much of the motion of his offense as it tended to slow down the tempo he wanted. Moving on across the formation to the Y receiver, the strong side slot. Traditionally, this was your dude, your jack of all trades. In Rich's early days at Glenville, RY was Chris George, and all he did was catch over 400 career passes and frustrate every defense we faced. The consummate playmaker and the perfect Y. Chris was the alpha among our receivers, the guy who almost certainly occupied the most real estate in Rich's call sheet. You game planned to get him plenty of touches. He was a pure athlete with incredible hands, a great route runner who was explosive in space and had a gear the defense couldn't touch once he hit the second level. Everything you'd want in a wide receiver in the classic run and shoot offense. In the mid 2000s at West Virginia, the ridiculously talented Darius Raynaud often occupied this spot in Rich's offense. In 38 career games, Renaud caught 133 passes and averaged an eye-popping 12 yards per rush. Like a true Y slot, when West Virginia needed a play, Raynaud made one.
White dropping straight back, has time, firing over the middle. The pass is caught. Raynaud inside the 15. He's running to the end zone. He's in touchdown, West Virginia.
Rounding things out is the other traditional wideout spot, the Z. This position wasn't about extravagance, but utility. It called for an incredibly well-conditioned player with reliable hands and great physicality. Size was a bonus, but not a requirement as long as the player had a nasty streak as a blocker. This was a must as so many play calls, from the run game to slot screens, would be going in his direction as the outermost receiver to the strong side of the formation. He needed to be in top shape because of the number of times he'd be asked to push vertical and clear things out in the pass game for the Y. But also he needed steady hands as he would sometimes serve as the drop down in multiple high-low throw game concepts. But paramount was his tenacity as a blocker in both the run game and with quick screens. If the Z was unable to consistently move bodies on the perimeter, getting into an offensive rhythm would be impossible. Coach Rod's Z in those early days at Glenville was Derek Bellamy, a 4-year starter who quite simply earned the job by playing his butt off from the moment he stepped onto campus. That same physicality continued to surface in the receivers holding down the Z position for Rich at West Virginia years later. Whether it was 6'5", 215-pound Rayshawn Bolden, wearing defenses out to pave the way for big Steve Slayton runs, or Darrell Jallow, punching above his weight against future NFL cornerbacks like Darius Butler of Connecticut and Georgia's Paul Oliver in the Sugar Bowl to spring Steve Slayton to daylight. These receivers knew the only way to stay on the field was to carry their weight in the run game by blocking like their hair was on fire. But as we said up top, many of the things Rich covets at each of these receiver spots has evolved considerably over the arc of time, with a premium now on versatility. Case in point, decades ago, the ideal player at the Z position might have simply been a possession receiver who could block. But last year at Jack State, Rich got considerably more production from the position. Current Mountaineer Cam Vaughn, another former high school quarterback, is indeed an effective blocker, but he was also the Gamecocks' biggest weapon as a pass catcher in the throw game last year, averaging nearly 17 yards per grab and earning Conference USA All-Freshman team honors. and he did so while logging a ton of snaps at the Z spot for the Jack State offense. What we were doing offensively at Glenville was explosive and, yes, even revolutionary, but it obviously lacked the 30-plus years of modifications and changes and even consideration.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to ITG Clips and In the Gun podcast for more WVU football content. Watch the whole podcast episode by clicking the link above or in the description.